Hello, hello, welcome back to Supposedly Fun. I am Greg, here today to do my reading wrap-up for the month of August. We're already 5 or 6 days into September. I don't know what day it is. So I'm a little behind the curve, but I wanted to talk to you. I managed to get in 10 books in the month of August. That is the most I've gotten in any month in 2019 so far. Looking at my reading goals for the year, I wanted to read more books that emphasize the L, the B, and the T in the LGBT equation. I have my Goodreads in front of me, so pardon me while I look. Okay, I have one book that follows a lesbian character, and I'm going to count the Stonewall Reader because a lot of the excerpts in here are from lesbians, people who were identified as transsexual or transvestite at the time, but now would probably be acknowledged as part of the transgender community. So I have 2 books that qualify for that goal, and my other reading goal for the year is to read more books by women than by men. So of the 10 books, pardon me while I count, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 out of 10 were by women, so that's a majority. So doing pretty well on that. I don't have the number in front of me, but I was doing really well on that one so far. I'm just knocking that one out of the park. So of these 10 books, I've already discussed 3 in my Women in Translation month wrap up from yesterday. I will link that down below and maybe up here if I remember. The Vegetarian was part of that. I was kind of meh about this. I think my expectations going into this were just really high, and I was expecting something that is not exactly what the book is, and that's not really the book's fault, but it's kind of difficult to reconcile. The other ones that qualified for the Women in Translation month were Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata. I really enjoyed this one. It was very kind of fun, light. I do wish there was just like a little bit more of a punch in it, but it's a really good book. I absolutely recommend it. And the other one was Please Look After Mom by Kyung-Suk Shin. Somebody commented on my video from yesterday to point out that there were allegations of plagiarism against this book that I did not know about. So I've done a quick look into it. It looks like a court did absolve Kyung-Suk Shin of plagiarizing on this book. But it looks like there's also an older accusation from one of her earlier works that has not, as far as I've seen in a quick cursory Google of it, has not been absolved. So I don't really know how I feel about that right now. I have to look into it further, but the sad thing is I really enjoyed the book. I really liked it. It was my favorite of the books that I read for Women in Translation Month, and I have been looking forward to reading more books by Kyung-Suk Shin, but I'm going to look into this. I'm going to find out more. If you know more details, please feel free to drop them in a comment, because I will be looking into it, but any advice is welcome. I've also kind of talked about The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead, but kind of not really. I really enjoyed the book. I liked it a lot. I did a video in which I recommend books that you can read next, because it feels like everybody's already talked about The Nickel Boys on BookTube. So I didn't really know what else I could add to the conversation, except maybe talking about what can go on your reading list next. I will link that down below and up top if I remember later. And then the other one that I'm not really going to talk about right now is The Harbor, because I'm going to save this one. This is part of my Pulitzer Prize project. It's an addendum to it. So Ernest Poole won the first Pulitzer Prize, but basically it's from reports of the time, it seems that he won the first Pulitzer Prize for a book called His Family because people really loved The Harbor, which was published before there was a Pulitzer Prize. So I figured it would make sense to read both His Family and The Harbor. I read The Harbor first. This month I'm going to try to get to His Family. I will discuss both of them then. Spoiler alert, this book is fine. That's about it. Okay, so that takes care of 5 books right there. We got 5 more to go. Let's dive in. Let's start with the ones that I have in front of me. The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. I jumped into this one because Toni Morrison died, and I've been saying for such a long time that I want to read more of her books. It seems like a really good time to do it. I also really want to read Beloved, but I'm going to hold on to Beloved as part of my Pulitzer Prize project. It also seems to make sense to go to The Bluest Eye because this was actually her debut novel. It was published in 1970, and let me tell you something. For a debut novel, this is astonishing. She basically just emerged fully formed as a writer, which is probably not surprising because I believe she was working as an editor at Random House before she published her own book. But this is, oh my god, it's so good. But interestingly, when we get to the plot of The Bluest Eye, we kind of run into the same problem that we had with The Vegetarian, but the payoff in The Bluest Eye is much better. Because basically, the things that happen on the dust jacket that it tells you to expect happen in the last part of the book, like the last 20 to 30 pages. And the book is really short, by the way. It is 160 pages total. So the things that are on the dust jacket are there throughout the book, but most of them only happen at the end. And I hope that's not a spoiler, because I think the journey to get to that is really worth taking. The thing is, in the beginning, it's almost like a character study of a town. You get to know two girl sisters who know Pekala Breedlove, who is ostensibly the protagonist of this book. Pekala does not actually have much of a voice in this book, which is probably intentional, because I think everything Toni Morrison does is intentional and genius. So you kind of get to know the town and the people and the way they live, and their interpretation of Pekala and Pekala's family. And then what happens at the end is really just the cap on top of everything. And it works really well. I think there are areas where you can tell that Toni Morrison is a debut novelist. Some things are a little bit clunky, some things don't. I almost dropped it. Some things don't entirely work, but by and large, this is a tremendous book. Absolutely worthy of a place in the literary canon. Absolutely worth reading. I absolutely would recommend it to you. I am very much looking forward to getting to reading Beloved as part of my Pulitzer Prize project. I am also very much looking forward to reading more Toni Morrison. Sula, Song of Solomon, Jazz, A Mercy. The only book of hers that I had read before this was Home, which is one of her more recent books, and while that was great, it was not on the level of many of these other books, at least in terms of literary renown. So if you have recommendations on where I should go next with Toni Morrison, I would love to hear that. Leave me a comment down below. And by the way, I unfortunately could not go. The local independent movie theater in my town was showing the documentary about her, which I believe is called The Pieces I Am. And I watched the trailer. It looks so good. But I have it in my Netflix queue for when it is released on DVD. I can't remember if it's either later this month or next month. But I'm really looking forward to watching that as well. Up next, there was The Stonewall Reader, which was a buddy read with Ollie over at Book Draw. And this I really enjoyed, mostly. And Ollie actually had the same opinion of it. So basically, this is articles, essays, pieces of journalism, and pieces from larger autobiographical works or just nonfiction books that were written later that capture 3 periods in time. First, we have the before Stonewall period, which sets the scene for what life was like before the Stonewall riot, in the period before the more popular gay liberation movement, as it was known, after Stonewall, and just the Pride movement in general as we know it now. And then there is the during Stonewall period with articles, interviews about what happened the night of the riot. And then there's the after Stonewall period. And basically, what Ollie and I both came to as a conclusion is that the before Stonewall period is genius. The during Stonewall period is genius. The after Stonewall period kind of loses the plot a little bit, because it doesn't seem to cohere into any larger point. You don't actually get much of an accurate picture of what happens after Stonewall and what the movement comes forward to. It just almost feels like essays that are kind of touching on the after Stonewall period and the forming of a Pride movement, but not really. And I think that's really disappointing. And I understand why this book would not necessarily want to get into things like the AIDS epidemic or gay marriage or gays in the military or anything like that, because it's specifically talking about Stonewall as the linchpin that started the Pride movement as we know it today. However, I feel like you also can't separate any of those things from the modern Pride movement, So I could see where it would be a little bit messy. I just wanted a little bit more direction in that last part. However, it's a really good book. I think it's absolutely worth your time. And if you can find somebody to do a buddy read with, I would recommend it, because that was a really great experience. Talking with Ollie a lot, but since I had been curious when we launched and decided to do a buddy read about this, I was wondering, is this going to be a bad book for a buddy read? It's nonfiction. It's basically just chapters and vignettes about it. So the buddy read was mostly just sharing our own experiences and how we grew up in the closet, how we eventually came out of the closet, and how our experience kind of correlates to the experience of the people in the book and how our lives were better than some of the people in the book. And that was fascinating, and I really enjoyed that. And thank you, Ollie. Thank you. That was a great experience. Thank you for being open and so receptive to discussion about all of these things. I really enjoyed the experience, and I definitely recommend the book. I do just wish that last part had been a little stronger. And, perfect example, the last section of the book, the last chapter, is from Shirlane McCrary, who is the First Lady of New York City right now, and her essay is great. I think she's worthy of inclusion, but did she really merit the last? It feels like it puts a lot of importance on her story, which is great, but doesn't cohere into anything about Stonewall itself or about the after Stonewall period. So it's just emblematic of how I think the last section kind of lost the plot. But otherwise, I would definitely recommend this book. Then we have Spectacles, a memoir by Sue Perkins. If you are not of the Great British Bake Off community, you may not know that Sue Perkins was one of the original hosts of the Great British Bake Off. And she hosted with her comedy partner, Mel Giedroyc, and they left the show when it moved from the BBC to I don't know what channel in the UK, but it left the BBC, that's all I know. So this memoir was written while she was still on the Great British Bake Off. Sue Perkins is a comedian, so it's probably pretty expected that her book is really funny. I laughed out loud a lot. What was not expected was that this book has now joined the ranks of books that have made me cry. And now, in 2019, there have been 3 books that have made me cry. There are not that many books that have made me cry, so I don't know what's in the water. I don't know if it's the fact that I'm reading a lot more books this year than I've read in any other year. But basically, she talks about... No, this is not a spoiler. She talks about how much she wanted a dog as a child, but her father always said no because having a pet always leads to heartbreak. Well, as an adult, she gets a dog, it leads to heartbreak, and I can't emotionally handle that because I have 2 dogs, and I can't even watch a movie about a dog dying. My husband he'll say like, oh, we should watch this movie about a dog, and I'm like, no, because I bet the dog dies in the end, but it always dies in the end. Why? I don't want to live through that. He wanted to watch 8 Below. I refused to do it because I know at least one of those dogs is going to die. I can't emotionally handle it. So that was absolutely heartbreaking before I go on a tangent. I will say the part where she's a child into her teens is fantastic. Absolutely wonderful. Once she becomes an adult, it becomes a little bit slippery. And what I mean by that is things start happening out of order. Things don't always make sense. There's not a whole lot of explanation about how things happen or why things happen or what she's doing and when. And I am sure some of that is for privacy. Like, she talks about getting into a relationship and then the relationship ends. And she doesn't really explain how the relationship ends. From what she says, you can guess what happened. But it starts to fall into the trap that I don't like about memoirs, which is where they start being really superficial. They don't actually want to reveal anything. They're worried about the surface and they don't want to let you get too deep. And that was a little frustrating. And I didn't like that some of it was happening out of order because it feels like when you tell a story and things happen out of order and that's the way it is. But it also feels like it would have been fairly easy to take some of these chapters and just put them in the order that they would happen chronologically. So, for instance, the dog dies. Literally, the next chapter, she's talking about going somewhere with her dog. And I'm, emotionally devastated, still have, tears and snot running down my face. And the dog is back, which just made it worse, by the way. She'd already broken up with her girlfriend, but then in this story, which is with the dogs, the girlfriend shows up and is in the house still. I don't know. So I guess I just wanted a little bit more from the ending. The ending started to feel a little bit sloppy. However, I do still recommend this book. I think it was funny. If you are a Bake Off nut like I am, you can't really go wrong with it. And then I listened to the audio of The Maid by Stephanie Land, and I've already done a review of that book. I loved it. It was really good. I will link my full review down below, and if I remember, up here. Alright, so the only book left at this point I listened to on audio, and that is Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. This is kind of a letter to his son. That's the framework of the book, but it's him talking about his experience growing up as a black man in America, and all of the insidious and pervasive ways he learned to think of himself as less than white people in America. I think this is a really important book for any white dude in particular like me to read, because it's sometimes really difficult to wrap your head around the differences between yourself and somebody else, and how somebody else can have a different experience of the world than you. So it's easy to say, well, that's not a problem. I've never experienced that in my life. Well, just because you have not experienced it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, doesn't mean it's not a valid experience of the world. So I do think this is a really important book from that perspective, because it's really eye-opening, and I think it's one thing to acknowledge and understand that racism is pervasive in the country. It is another to see how, again, pervasive and just it is, and how it works its way into every facet of a person's life, to the point where he even has to think about his own expectations for living, and has to worry about protecting himself because the world would like to kill him, basically. And it's just a really good, important, I'd say capital I important book to read. I finally got around to it. I've been wanting to do it for a while. And by the way, the audio is only about 3.5 to 4 hours, and Ta-Nehisi Coates reads it himself, and I think that adds a level of poignancy to it. So I absolutely enjoyed this book and recommend it to you. And those are the books that I read in the month of August, all 10 of them. And if you have read any of these, I'd love to hear it. Let me know what you thought down below. I would also love to hear what you read in the month of August, even if it's different from these, and what you thought of it. So leave that down below as well. I really liked all of these books. I don't think there's a dud in the bunch. I complained at length about some of them, but I don't regret reading any of them. I would recommend them all. So I'm not going to pick a least favorite for the month, for sure. And I don't think I'm going to pick a favorite either, because I think the books that I liked, and I would say, have very different approaches. It would probably come down to The Bluest Eye. What the hell? I'm just going to say The Bluest Eye was my favorite read of the month. It's so good. It's definitely up there in my favorites of the year. I don't think it's going to break the top 2, but it's up there. So, sure. I just talked myself into giving The Bluest Eye my favorite read of the month, for whatever that's worth. So again, I'd love to hear what you read. Leave it down below. Let me know what you thought of these if you have read them. And thank you for your time watching this video. As always, it's really appreciated. And I'll be back again. Until then, happy reading.